And then the last point that Dr. Stern brings up in his book here is that people argue that Messianic Judaism is artificial. It's not indigenous. They argue that it's really the Bible is a Christian book, and that Messianic Judaism is something that's been kind of added, on top of that. But again, without going into too many details, it's obvious to see that this is not true. And then let me jump down into chapter, I think it's chapter 4. I had some notes that I wanted to talk about as well, if I can accelerate this part of my study. He talks in his book about the separation of the church and the Jewish people. He talks, over the last 2,000 years, separation of church and synagogue. And he talks about how that earlier on in history, there were tens of thousands of Torah observant Jews. And it was quite normal to be a Jew and believe in Jesus. And it was also quite normal in the early synagogues to find Gentile Christians following after not only Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, but also following after parts of the Torah, even though they weren't Jewish, even though these people weren't Jewish. So history, however, has shown, as I'm scrolling a bit through Dr. Stern's notes, has shown that we lost that expression of Christianity in the first century, where Jews and Gentiles were kind of worshiping together under a Messianic Judaism slash first century Christianity, and there was no really qualm with one another, as long as we recognized our equality in Messiah and our equal access to the Torah. But that quickly changed over the following few centuries, for second, third, and fourth centuries, as the church became predominantly more and more Gentile flavored, and Messianic Judaism really kind of went underground, got pushed out of the equation. Torah got pushed out of the room, and so the whole discussion kind of went silent, went cold for the last 1900 or so years, until we've got this re-emergence of a Messianic Judaism. And for many in historic Christianity, it seems like it's a brand new thing, but in reality, it's a resurgence of an ancient kind of a cultural expression of Judaism that has existed from long ago. And that's kind of what Dr. Stern talks about. He talks about why Jewish history is my history as a Messianic Jew, and why it should be relevant for you as Christians. And then he talks about, again, Moses from the earliest times has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogue every Shabbat. Of course, that's a quote from the Bible. And a quote from the book of Acts chapter 15, where the Jerusalem council got together and factored in the idea, how do we deal with our nationalism and our blindness, and how do we allow Gentiles to come to the gospel, but not force them to keep parts of Torah in order to express their covenant membership and things like that. And so those are some of the notes from Dr. Stern's book that I wanted to just highlight in these final few minutes. I just want to talk about how that in my own commentary to Galatians on my own website, I've got some questions and answers under a section called common objections. Hang on, I forgot the title now. 10 common questions regarding Torah observance for Gentile Christians. That's the section in my Galatians notes. And if you scroll down, let me just kind of skim through some of them and kind of make you aware of these objections, continuing objections. When I talk about Torah observance for Gentile Christians, some of the objections or questions, some of them are outlined objections, some of them are just questions because people are curious about what it would be like for Gentile Christians to embrace Torah. I have to talk about the definition of what is Torah when I'm using it, versus when Jewish people use it, versus when Christians use it. And I answer those questions. To whom was Torah given, and who is required to allow to follow it? Historically, Gentiles believe that it was given to Jews. Historically, Gentiles believe it was given to Jews, and therefore it seems like the answer to the question of who's required or allowed to follow it, the answer seems to be, well, it should be for Jewish people. But I challenge that. It was exclusively given to Israel. That's true. However, that's simply from the perspective of God choosing Israel as the as the servants, as the conveyors, as the ambassadors. That's what I mean by given to Israel exclusively. It was not blasted around the world and given to all the nations of the world at the time. It was exclusively given to a people gathered at the foot of Sinai, Exodus chapter 20, where God chiseled out the 10 words, and then Moses wrote down the rest of the Torah for the people to understand. That's what I mean by given to Israel exclusively. However, it was not given to Israel for the express purpose of limiting it to Israel and restricting it to Israel. There was a kind of a Jewish Great Commission going on. Deuteronomy chapter 4. Israel was supposed to showcase the Torah so that the surrounding nations would want to be drawn into the lifestyle of faith in God and walking after His ways. So that's what I mean by that particular answer. Didn't Yeshua fulfill the law and nail it to the cross? A lot of opposition to keeping Torah based on that perspective. The answer is no, He didn't nail it to the cross. He actually nailed the debt that we owed to God because of our sin nature. He nailed that debt to the cross. And so now He set us free to be able to walk into covenant faithfulness, which includes Torah obedience and Torah observances and things like that. He didn't nail the Torah to the cross. Moving down into my own answers, question 4 that I hear from many Gentile Christians: didn't Paul teach in many locations that we're free from the law? The phrase "free from the law" is a misnomer, a misunderstanding. We are free from the condemnation of the law. You can read about this in Romans chapter 6. We are free from the penalty expressed in the Torah that is outlined for unrepentant sinners. We are not free from the law obligation, and we're certainly not free from being punished by God if we still, even as believers, blatantly thumb our nose at God's righteous standards. God can and will punish us if we step out. He is our loving Father, and if you're not receiving punishment as the child of God, then you might need to check your status as a true child of God, right? That's kind of loosely based on a passage as well. So free from the law in Paul's writings doesn't mean free from obligation to keep the Torah in its obedient fashion. Rather, free from the law really is kind of shorthand for free from the condemnation of the law. If you look at the verses where Paul utilizes this, like I said, Romans chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 kind of as a unit. If you read through those in one setting, you'll see that as well. Moving along, question 5, Paul says in Romans 6:14 that we're not under the law but under grace. This is kind of dovetailing on the first on the previous objection, or free from the law. Under the law is under the condemnation of law. Shorthand, Paul's shorthand for under the condemnation of law, or under the bondage to sin. So remember, in the Bible, in Paul's writings, he outlines this diabolical relationship that the Torah and sin have with one another. Sin and the law partnered up with one another. It wasn't the law's fault, it was sin's fault, by the way, but the sin and the law partnered up with one another, and in so doing, they brought the man of God down into a place where he was condemned because of his unrighteous actions. It labeled him a sinner, and he was hopelessly condemned without any solution. And so the law spelled out those penalties. It spelled out that condemnation. It labeled him a sinner, and he was headed for self-destruction. He was headed for condemnation. He was headed for sentencing. Until Jesus, the DA, stepped in, right? Our court-appointed DA stepped in and set us free from those penalties. He paid the price himself. He removed that guilt. And so the label over us has been changed, right? We've been acquitted, and we're no longer guilty. We're no longer sinners. We're no longer condemned. And therefore, we're not only no longer under the penalty of the law, the condemnation, but we're also no longer under the bondage, because the Spirit of God in us, right, Jesus living inside of us, has given us the ability to walk free from that bondage to sin. We have a new volition and a new will within us. We now have a desire to walk in God's ways, and we no longer have a desire to sin. We actually grieve over sin the way God grieves over sin, and that's because the Spirit inside of us has given us this new volition, and we're actually now empowered to actually walk in the ways of God, whereas we couldn't before, because we were under bondage and under condemnation and under all of that oppression. So when we say we're not under law, it's twofold. We're no longer under the condemnation and penalty of sin. That's one aspect. And Paul teaches we're no longer under the bondage and oppression to sin as well. That's the two aspects of under law, but it certainly doesn't mean under obligation to keep the Torah when Paul says we're no longer under law but under grace. The grace part steps in when we sin and cry out for forgiveness, and God, instead of condemning us and punishing us commensurate with the sin that we commit, God instead extends forgiveness and grace and grants us a renewed sense of urgency to continue to walk in God's ways and keep walking away from sin.